Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Awaken Your Soul's Journey podcast. Again, I'm Angela, and I am really excited to introduce to you Susannah Rose Stokes. And she, after serving in 2 combat tours in Afghanistan as a Marine Corps officer, she experienced a spiritual awakening that changed her life forever. And since then, she's dedicated her life as an energy priestess and embodied consciousness guide. And she served dozens of people in one-on-one and group ceremonies, guiding them in their own spiritual awakening process, which I love. She co-founded the House of Embodied Metamorphosis, a faith-based organization that utilizes the Metamorphosis Method and a community-cultivated strain of psilocybin, which we're going to learn more about. Hers is known as Trinity, to facilitate powerful personal transformations through retreats and coaching programs. And she authored
Entheogenerated. That's what it is. Yes.
There we go.
It's a made-up word.
Okay.
And I'll tell you all about it.
I'm sure you will. That's great. A comprehensive research of psychedelics and their capacity to create individual and collective change. And she is a graduate of the US Naval Academy and speaks Mandarin, Chinese, and Spanish, all in serving to create more peace and connectedness in the world. So thank you so much for, thanks everybody for enduring that bio.
That was beautiful, beautiful. And yes, I threw some things in there to see how well our English is these days.
Well, there's some new words in there, and
Yes,
that's great because we're going to learn some new things, and that's what we're here for. So it's awesome. So tell me, give me a little bit of a background. Like, how do you go from a Marine Corps officer to having an awakening and then, getting into all of this?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting because from the perspective of where I'm at now, it all makes perfect sense. But when we see those two archetypes, right? When we see the warrior, and then we see the priest or priestess or the person who's a spiritual, like working in spiritual work. We think that they're so different and they're so far apart, but actually there's a lot of crossover in the lifestyles of those beings, right? A lot of discipline that goes into focusing on a bigger cause. There's a lot of sort of sacrificing parts of our own happiness and joy in service to something greater. There's a lot of similarities, I think, in both. And for me, growing up, I think I always had actually both of those somewhere in my psyche, somewhere in my desire in life. And I always felt pulled between the two. I always found myself to be like the hippie in the midst of the warriors. And my father was in the Marine Corps. All of the men in my family had done some service in the military. So there was a sort of family legacy that I was fulfilling and that I was not necessarily expected to do, but I was definitely encouraged on that path. And what that led me in was, I remember as I was sort of planning out my life at 12 years old, as one does, I was debating between the Marine Corps and the Peace Corps. I was like, Peace Corps could be really interesting. And I remember being very fascinated by yoga, and I was a gymnast. So anything related to, physical well-being was always very interesting to me. But ultimately, it was the call of my family and the pull of my father's influence that really pushed me in the direction of the military. And so I went in the deepest way I knew how, which was because when I do things, I go all in. I am all into this. I am all into this. I am fully committed. So I knew when I was about 12 years old that I wanted to join the Marine Corps and become an officer. And that's what led me to the Naval Academy. And from there, at the Naval Academy, you can either commission into the Navy or you can commission into the Marine Corps. And so that was my obvious choice. And it was pretty quick that when I entered into the Marine Corps, there's a show I used to watch where they would go, I've made a huge mistake when they realize something. And I had that feeling, I had a sort of regret feeling very early on where I was like, oh, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. And there were still parts of me that absolutely did, that I craved the discipline, I craved the brotherhood, sisterhood. There were all these ways in which I felt like I fit in, and then a lot of ways in which I didn't. So that sets the stage for your question. But that's really what drew me into the military in the first place and got me there.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, the podcast is about grief. And I know that often grief can be a catalyst for spiritual awakening. And I think there's a bit of a story there with you about how that might have come about.
Most definitely. And at that time, I had not fully embraced grief. I think only since I've deepened into my healing process have I had a word for it. Right now, I understand a lot of what I was going through was grief, but at the time, I was just sort of focusing on my mission, full speed ahead, doing as much as I possibly could in service to this bigger vision that may not even have been mine, And I
Mhm.
think a lot of us have that feeling. And I think that the first bit of grief that I really started that embodied in me and caused me great angst was when I first joined the Marine Corps. I had graduated from the Naval Academy, and as a Marine, you go through the basic school, which is a 6-month training program to learn how to lead troops into battle, no matter what your job is. Even if you're a lawyer or a pilot, you still have to learn the ground techniques. And I had a leader who was, by all accounts, misogynistic, was actively working against the feminine to really keep her down. And because I am a fiery one, I definitely got on his nerves, and we repelled each other in a lot of ways. And it was the first time I'd felt what discrimination felt like. And to be honest, I really didn't run into that many men in the Marine Corps who were that intentionally or that directly misogynistic. There was a lot of bro culture. There was a lot of kind of leaving women out of things. Of course, there was sexual assault and things along those lines. And I'll speak about the grief of that too. But this was the one person that I encountered that really had sort of like a vendetta. And the grief of being sidelined or being picked out and picked on simply because I am a woman activated a lot of the collective feminine grief in me. And I started to understand why women were fighting for women. And it definitely activated my activist part of me. But there was a huge part of it that was all about growing up a little bit and realizing that not everything was just, sunshine and rainbows. There was a lot of inequality in the world, and I felt that deep into my bones.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, this was a bit of a catalyst, really probably a big catalyst for where you are now. So, what was your awakening like? Like, how did it start to happen? And tell me some of the stages that you went through.
Yeah. And also related to grief
Yeah.
is this process, because after that, I was deployed quite quickly to Afghanistan. Interestingly, in the military, everyone wants to deploy. That's the whole point, right? They want to get out and be fighting and be in war. And I did not. Surprise. I really wanted to be helping in humanitarian aid and things like that, which is kind of what my weird mind thought I might be doing in the Marine Corps. And so during my first deployment, I was there and I began to feel the level of loneliness, a level of loneliness that I'd never felt before. It was just like complete disconnection, obviously, from people I loved, from my family, from my community, from at the time, my husband. I just felt so isolated. And I began to go into like a deep depression and a feeling of overwhelming grief, which, of course, at the time I still didn't have words for. I just knew that I felt alone, I felt scared, and I felt like no one could fully understand what I was experiencing. And that carried over into my second deployment, which then created, during that deployment, I felt not just the grief and the loneliness, but I began to question a higher power. And I think this is also part of, right? This is part of the process. I think about the grief process of like DABDA, which I kind of add on to when I work with clients, and grief is like denial, right? And at the beginning of all of this, I was just purely in denial. I had no idea that I was going through that. Then there's the acceptance. I also think there's an awareness period where you become aware that you are grieving or there's something to grieve. Then there's the acceptance that the thing happened. And then there's the bargaining phase. And I was really in the bargaining in that second deployment. Like, how is it possible that there's some higher power and that higher power is allowing this kind of destruction to happen in the world and people to harm each other in this way? And so I did a lot of study of sacred texts. And then as I got out of the Marine Corps, I got divorced. I went through a divorce process. That was definitely like deep into grief. And then that started to break me open and sort of break me out of my ego and help me realize that there had to be something more. And I also didn't want to continue living in a reality where there wasn't a God or there wasn't something spiritual, there wasn't something bigger, because I had grown up in the Methodist church, I had gone to Baptist churches, I'd always had some bigger power. And while those systems no longer served me, I knew that there had to be something. So I went in search of it. And that process of healing from military sexual trauma, I was also a victim advocate in the Marine Corps. So I worked with a lot of people who had been sexually assaulted and then took on some of their trauma too, because I didn't have, proper boundaries emotionally. And that entire experience just broke me down. And finally, I started to feel, in the next phase, there's bargaining, then there's depression. It's like deep sadness. And I finally allowed myself to start feeling sad. And that led me to psychedelics, which was the first way that I began to really heal myself.
Yeah. And so tell me more about how the psychedelics helped you.
So as I got out of the Marine Corps and then I went, that my human self, my ego self still wanted something to do while I was going through this massive process of recalibration. And I ended up going to San Francisco, where the tech industry is based. That's where I got my first job, actually out of the military, which was working at Facebook, which is now Meta.
Huh?
And so that was an interesting experience and a kind of a transition, right, from one
Mhm.
community to another. Interestingly, the tech industry also has a lot of the same like cultiness of the military.
Really? Okay.
Yeah,
Well, it
yeah.
makes, yeah. Mhm.
There's some crossovers there.
Yeah.
And a reason why a lot of veterans want to go into tech. It also has like there's a riskiness to it, right? There's like a newness and a risk. So yeah, so I ended up there in that area. Of course, plant medicines are more recreational. They're more accepted. San Francisco is that kind of place where new ideas are born and people are more comfortable exploring and experimenting with these kinds of things, and they don't see them as drugs the way that a lot of the world sees plant medicines. They see them a little more like medicines, and also see the things that we think of as medicines or medications as drugs, because SSRIs and opiates and things like that really are quite damaging. So as I explored that, I also, like probably a lot of people listening to this, I had so many stigmas in my mind around it. And coming from a highly conservative upbringing, somewhat military family. My grandfather was a bishop in the Methodist Church. All of his lineage were pastors. Like, it was a very Southern conservative lifestyle in a lot of ways, with a lot of academic openness. I have a lot of academics in my family who are, like you, curious, right? Very interested to know more. So I had these ideas about like LSD and psilocybin that they were going to bond to my DNA, and they could find them 20 years after I died, and they were going to change me forever, make me jump out of a building and not control myself.
Yeah, because that's
And
what we're all told,
that's
right?
what we're told, right?
Mhm.
And of course, when I did my research, I learned why we were told that, because of course they were a threat to, the Vietnam War effort, which caused Nixon to implement the war on drugs, and then the war on drugs created and then was continued by Reagan. And ultimately there was a huge sort of smear campaign to stop people from becoming pacifists, essentially. And also, I will say, in defense of of the government's actions, there also was a lot of recklessness with LSD and with psilocybin, and there was not a lot of regulation. I mean, it was all underground, so there was a lot of lack of boundaries with these medicines. They weren't being used as medicines quite in the way that they should be. So when I first sat with LSD at a little tiny festival and I was looking out over the mountains and over this river, I saw the trees breathe. And I'd grown up on a farm in Georgia. And so I had been raised by Mother Earth, and I had forgotten a lot of the ways that she is so powerful for our health, and that I'm part of her and she's part of me. And when I saw the trees breathe, physically, I could see them like expand and contract almost like they had lungs. I was like, what? Oh my gosh, I remember this. And it woke me up to a lot of these memories that I had when I was a little girl, of knowing how connected I am and that I'm never alone. And it created that sense of connectedness, that interconnection with all things. And it introduced me to the idea of oneness in a very felt way. And so that was the first time, that was literally just my first psychedelic journey. And from there, I was sort of intrigued and I was curious to know more. So I did do a lot of exploration, but one that stands out as like the moment of awakening was I had sat with bufo, which is a medicine that's from the Sonoran desert toad. And it is a very beautiful and powerful medicine that's a little bit like a consciousness rocket ship that takes you real fast out of your body into spiritual space. Like if you were going to astral project, but you had jet fuel, right? It's a little bit like that. And then 2 weeks later, and that experience was actually very difficult for me. That process of, I felt like I was being ripped away from my body. So that experience was not easy. But then 2 weeks later, because no one told me not to, because there wasn't a lot of guidance in this journey, I was recreationally sitting with LSD with a group of friends in a very contained, beautiful place. And I was meditating on the top of a mountain. And that's what I was called to do in that moment, because the medicine called me to sit with earth and just like be there. And I felt this vortex of energy, like a tornado, come down into my body and completely awaken what some might call a Kundalini awakening, that felt like I completely disappeared into nothingness and I was just this tornado of energy. And then the universe showed me, or God, or whatever word you choose to use for source, showed me the perfection of my bloodline on both sides of like why I am who I am
Mm.
and what I'm here to do as a result of being this person's daughter, this person's grand, et cetera, et cetera. And it showed me the whole perspective in like what felt like milliseconds. And that experience was really the grounding and the embodiment of my purpose that allowed me to get a lot of the other excess stuff that I'd built up in my life out of the way and begin to shed the layers of ego of, and I don't say ego in a bad way. I just mean like the personality, the mask that I had built to interact with other people. And slowly but surely, it was that moment, that particular journey that really facilitated a recognition and a remembering of who I am, which I would consider to be like a spiritual awakening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I hear this again and again, from people about spiritual awakenings and the way that it happens. And it doesn't always happen with, some kind of plant medicine. Sometimes they're just in meditation and bam, these kinds of things happen. And it's fascinating to hear people say over and over that that connection with everyone being one, and that, because when we're feeling alone and disconnected, and I think you talked about that, just the grieving process of being alone is really intense, and not thinking that anyone understands you touched on that, and that's a lot that comes out when I talk to people in grief, is that it changes your identity, and so then therefore you don't really know who you are anymore. It's very confusing and chaotic, and you feel alone and you feel like nobody understands you, and you get into this spirit of questioning why am I here, what am I here to do? What is my purpose? What is the meaning of all of this? And so it creates that. And I just find it fascinating that everybody has kind of a different way of getting to this, what seems like a similar place of understanding.
1000%. It is like, I mean, as I've started, because I'm a spiritual scientist and it feels like you might be as well a little bit, right? Like I love to observe and watch the patterns arise. And as I've started to observe the patterns of spiritual awakenings that I've seen in our work at Metamorphosis and just around me in life, now I'm surrounded by people who are going through spiritual awakenings because I'm calling that energy in. And there are so many milestones that are actually very similar. And so when people are describing their process, I'm like, oh, you're in this phase of the awakening. Great. Like, good. And they're like, yeah, but I hate this. And I'm like, and I'm telling you, it leads to something incredible, but you have to go through what I would call the period of disillusionment. There's a period of like, as we step into purpose, we really go through like 4 phases. And the first is resistance. And there's something around you that you're resisting. And there's physical body resistance that happens. We usually go through physical ailments in our body because our body is reacting to the system around us. And our body's like, no, I cannot be in here anymore. So, and our body doesn't lie, right? And that then kind of trickles into emotional and mental resistance, which is the disillusionment part. And the disillusionment is the crumbling of everything that we thought we knew, all of the truths, all of this is how my world works, all of that, and allowing it all to completely dissolve. And the disillusionment process is very uncomfortable, typically, Some people are like, oh, maybe you're like a really awesome surfer and you're just super chill about it. And you're like, okay, great. Like my whole life is falling apart. But that was not me. Mine was a little harder than that. And then there's a period um, of surrender. And the surrender part, and I also think a lot of these come in waves, and there's also like the spiral of spiritual progression, which they speak about in a lot of faiths, right? And so you kind of come back to some of these multiple times in different layers. And there's different layers of surrender. Like I've been in a process of surrender over the last 6 months, even though I was also in a process of surrender 4 years ago and then 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Seems to happen in 4 years. And that surrender is the process of letting go of all of those realities that you thought you had built, that you thought were right, that you thought was the way the world works. And when you let it go and you surrender into trust, you start to fall backward and feel like you can trust something bigger. You have to trust something bigger because the surrender is just like, I don't know. I don't know what's next. I have no idea. Here I go. And I'm going to fall backwards off this cliff and really hope that something catches me or I grow wings.
Mm-hmm.
And that next phase after that is then play. Because then once you trust that there's something much bigger, much more powerful than you, much more knowing than you, and with you, right? In you as well, you can just play. You can just enjoy and kind of like a falcon, that learns that it actually can rely on the wind, on the air. It can just glide. And it's like, oh, I don't have to do much. All I have to do is put my wings out, and this much bigger thing is going to keep me afloat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that whole piece, and I mean, I've been doing some interesting stuff. I went on a retreat to Bali and I came back, and of course, it dug up a whole bunch of things for me to reconsider and think about.
Especially Bali. That's the kind of place you do that work.
Yeah, and so it's been fascinating because I was in a space of where I was doing things, I was creating things, everything seemed to be going, and then all of a sudden there was kind of like this pause, and it's been for quite a while, and I was very uncomfortable, and still am a little bit uncomfortable in that space of pause, but still learning that all of this is part of it, right? And having that trust and faith and surrender in the fact that all of this is for me, not against me, and it's just like you say, leaning back and allowing that to happen and being okay with it all and not trying to, I'm going to make something happen.
I think that this is one of the perhaps the tricks and also one of the blessings of the universe is that it is a spiral. And I would like to think that it's an upward spiral. We're all spiraling upward in our expansion and our progression. And that means that you're going to come back to a similar place to where you were before. And each time you'll have this opportunity to surrender or trust or whatever phase you're in. And the next time you're there, it can be a little bit easier because you're like, I think I remember this
Yeah.
from before. I think I remember this feeling. And so we can learn, right? We can learn and progress
Mhm.
to these different layers, but it does take it takes a little bit of repetition to get good at it, to really practice that element of surrender. Because no matter what, the disillusionment, the dissolving of our reality, like this, when my reality dissolved again in 6 months ago, I was like, universe, what the insert curse word here. I was like, what in the world? And the universe was like, and God or source or, these beings that I work with were all like, but you know how to do this now. Like, you're good at this now. You got this. And this is just us bringing you even closer every step to who you actually are. So just let it go and stop trying to cling so tightly to these things that you think are real, are true. Like, this is what the human experience is about shedding away to get to the purity that's inside that real beautiful spiritual space. And I also think, because I'm an embodied consciousness guide, that a big piece that people don't talk about in these journeys is the embodiment of it, is the integration of it, right? And there's so much about, oh, let's leave the body, let's astral project, let's go out and get these like peak experiences. And this is one of the challenges I do have with the psychedelic world, is there is sometimes a hunger and a grasping for leaving the physical realm. And I definitely had a period of time where there was part of me that wanted to leave the physical realm to go get these like cosmic experiences. And what I realized was, it's all right here. It's all right here in front of me. Like, all of my lessons, all of my work, all of my progression, it's all in the relationships around me. It's all in my physical body's process. And that also requires a level of surrender.
Yeah, and I've heard that before too. And actually, that was a little bit profound for me, that, once you go through an experience like I did in Bali, or, one of those experiences that you provide, then we have to live. We have to live in this 3D world, and we have to, like you say, integrate and figure out what we're all about in this space. And yeah, it's fascinating, because like you say, I would run from one healer to the next. In the beginning, I would look for, well, this one must have the answer, I'll get the answer here, and you'd have this aha moment, and you'd think, that's it, I've got it.
That's the thing. That's the one thing that will change my life forever.
And it's just,
Kind of.
no, no, that didn't do it, but
Right.
that was but
It
it
was
was almost like,
helpful to get you to the next clue in the scavenger
yes.
of life, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it's almost like, it's like a little carrot. Like, it's like, ooh, I'm going to go after this one, and I'm going to go after that one. And then at some point you go, hey, this is
I
a
have a basket
thing.
full of carrots. Why? What am I going to do with all of these? Am I going to eat carrots for the next 10 years? I think that is such a challenge that we're having too, because yeah, the 3D world right now is a challenging place to be. And I personally believe that we are exiting, thank heavens, the dark ages. I think we've been in a cycle. We typically go through, kind of 500-year cycles. And I believe that we've been in a 500-year cycle of darkness. And that with the Piscean age really brought us into our shadows, and showed us as a humanity the dark parts of our world, in order to birth us into what I believe is the golden age that we're stepping into now. An age of balance, and an age of understanding, of brotherly and sisterly love, of real like deep connection. And like the polarities, of course, it's not going to be all roses and butterflies. It'll be both, but they'll be more in balance than the dark ages we've been in. But as a result of being in those dark ages for so long, and having the heaviness of the world that we've created right now, in particular, at this particular time, a lot of people want to escape, right? And so we have a lot of methods for escaping, and healing can be used for that too. You can escape through your healing journey. You can escape through addiction. You can escape through any kind of substance, whether it be plant medicine, medication, drugs, anything. And the question is, how do we encourage ourselves first, and then each other, to actually stay in it? Because I truly believe that now it's our emotional processing and meeting each thing that comes up that actually does bring us into genuine balance, right? But the more we avoid, or the more we leave to find that one little thing, the more we're repressing and pushing away parts of ourselves. So there actually isn't an ability to fully integrate into wholeness. And that process is a little messy. Like when I encourage people through that process in their own lives, I can tell you that if they're not paying me to do it, they usually want me out of their life. They're like, get out of here. I don't want your root cause healing. But if they're paying me and they came to me for that purpose, then they're deeply grateful for the encouragement and the accountability to go into these places that they normally wouldn't have looked, and they normally wouldn't have stayed with those parts of themselves for as long. But this is the act of integration. Integration is about staying with the parts of ourselves that we've avoided for most of our lives.
Yeah. 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 And that's, like you say, it's not easy. And it's nice to have support through that. I find that I seek out support. I don't like to do it all by myself. I know that a lot of it I can do if I sit and I go within and I take in those messages and I take the time to do that. But it is nice to have somebody guiding you and supporting you along the way.
Oh, it's so much better. And one of the things that we really believe at Metamorphosis is the power of community in that process. Because so we believe in ceremony, a blend of ceremony, coaching, and then community, right? And really coaching is like the mental tools that we use, whatever techniques you use for your integration process. It could be breath work, it could be prayer, it could be meditation, it could be whatever your process is to support and create the structural activities, right, to integrate. But the community piece is so critical, whether it's one person who is facilitating for you or sitting there with you and also witnessing you, or it's an entire group of people who are mirroring back to you things that they're going through. And you're like, oh, yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, right? And that's one thing that we see a lot in our group containers is healing can happen like exponentially faster in community and greater. There's a much bigger, quote, bandwidth for healing and for change because everyone starts to recognize how similar their challenges are with everyone else, which boosts empathy between all of us. It then increases trust. And then you feel safer and more held by everyone. And typically, you start to recognize that their healing is your healing too.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I would concur in the group that I have right now. Oh, like you watch the transformation that's taking place amongst everyone. And what I said to them all, it's like we've built this panel of experts that just, we all have our own things that we've gone through that we've learned and we share. And then, like you say, the light bulb goes on over here. This one realized, oh my gosh, that really made a difference for me to understand that. It's amazing to watch that transformation. And so this whole idea of community, yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree. Yeah.
It's like the secret nugget in our next phase of healing as a society, right? It's what the feminine really brings. She brings that reminder that none of this has to happen in isolation. None of this has to happen in the privacy of your own home. You do not have to suffer alone. In fact, you shouldn't suffer alone. We should suffer together because at least it'll feel a little bit better, right? Misery loves company in some ways. And I think that's actually a beautiful thing, right? We want to be accompanied and have friends on that journey of grief. And one thing that occurs to me is how powerful grief is as a portal for joy. I believe that on the other side of every dark emotion is a light emotion. It's sort of the yin yang of our emotional landscape. And grief, if you look at the emotional frequency chart and you match up the two emotions that are equidistant from the middle, which is neutrality, joy is on one side, roughly, and grief is on the other. And I love that because it means that when you allow yourself to go deep into grief and you actually feel it and you feel the intensity of that emotion in your body, you then start to actually attune your body to be able to hold joy. Because joy, what a lot of people don't understand, is joy is a very uncomfortable, it's actually just as uncomfortable to hold pure joy in your body as it is to hold grief, because it's such a high frequency. It's so intense, right? To feel that elated and blissful about something. But when you practice holding grief and you learn how to do that, you can transmute it and turn it inside out into joy. And your body becomes a safe place to actually feel joy and to be present enough to feel joy, because joy moves faster than the speed of light. So you can't hold it. It's just got to go through. And that I find is easier done in community than anything else, because you can see how other people do it, right? And you're given permission to go even deeper into the grief than you ever would by yourself.
Right. Yeah. And I've heard a lot of people, and I've experienced this myself, you know, the level of joy and happiness that I am able to embody or feel now is much different than before I lost my husband. And I realized that, I was going on kind of a little mediocre type, never too happy and never too sad. You just kind of and you
Right there in the middle. Yeah.
yeah, and you don't realize that you're not feeling that range of emotions, that you're resisting or holding yourself in that space that's comfortable for you, and not allowing yourself to feel that range of emotions. And when you do it, it's surprising actually, and it catches you off guard, and you think, well, why am I feeling so much joy when I should be so sad? Right?
Yes.
There's
Yes.
that too. Yeah.
That's definitely a common experience of, once we start to be able to hold these deep, deep sort of shadow emotions, right? Which are no better or worse than the light emotions, everything in balance. The body begins to have a capacity to hold both. You start to go like, right? If it's sort of like I think of it like two funnels with their ends touching together. When you get toward the middle, you realize that grief and joy are really not all that different in a lot of ways. They're actually quite similar in the way they feel, in the things that bring them up. Like it's like why we cry at things that make us really joyful, and then we cry at things that make us really sad. We have the same emotional reaction. And it's because we're right there in that center. And when you hold both in your system, it can be jarring at first, because a lot of us are taught that we're supposed to feel one thing and be one thing all the time.
Right.
And in fact, we are like onions, we've got all these layers and all this complexity that we have the capacity to hold. But it's only when you fully allow yourself to feel something. And I think for me, psychedelics helped me feel. That was a really big place where I could start to actually feel my feelings, feel my emotions, feel my body. And grief was a doorway to that. It was the doorway that encouraged me to go deeper, to explore what is feeling stuck, what's not feeling like me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then, that I totally resonate with that, because I talk about grief as something that we should embrace. It's actually a pathway to transformation. And grief is we can hold its hand and kind of let it be, it's the way we heal. It's showing us the way to heal. And so it's fascinating to have this conversation with you. And yeah, it's
Oh, good.
yeah,
Right. And isn't it cool when we start to find other people who like get this? You're
yes,
like,
yeah.
oh, you found that too, right? And we start to commune together and recognize that we're all discovering that in fact grief is this pathway to living life in a more joyful, balanced, integrated way. And there is a little bit of like, oh, that seems weird that that would be the path. You'd think we're taught the opposite way. We're taught the toxic positivity way. And
Mhm.
really, it's like it's that other pathway that looks really scary and goes through the forest. And you're like, that doesn't look safe. But really, that's where the treasure is. That's where it lies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so tell people how they can find you and what you can do for them.
Mm. Well, first, I would love for you to visit our website, which is Metamorphosis, which is a long word, but you can definitely Google it, and I promise it'll tell you the right spelling. Metamorphosis.ventures. And if you go there, you can also join. We do have a private chat and announcement chat that we gather our community in. We just send you little tips and things in there, as well as our newsletter, our weekly newsletter. And then you can also follow me on Instagram at Susannah Roses. We may have a place here where I can write it because my name is spelled a little differently than others. Um, and if there's any questions that you ever have around this, I really want people to feel like they can connect with me. So my email is Susannah, Sussannah, at metamorphosis.ventures. And I would love to answer your questions around plant medicine, around spiritual awakening, around working through the path of grief towards spiritual awakening, and just how to integrate those learnings into your life.
Love it. Hmm. And is there
Mhm.
anything else you'd like to add before we go?
Oh, well, this has just felt so nourishing, and I really am grateful to you for creating a space where we can speak about grief in this way of honoring it for what it does, what this process does for us, because so many of us avoid it. And it is one of those things that we kind of put in our back pocket and we're like, everything's okay. I'm going to dry my tears. And I think your approach, which it's not even heavy, it's just like this honest, curious nature of exploring how grief has impacted our lives toward awakening. Wow, I really, really love it. And so thank you for doing what you're doing and sharing this message with the world. It means a lot.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking the time today and sharing all that you've shared. And I've really, really enjoyed it. And I encourage people to check out your website, check out what you do. And if it resonates with you, to go see what Susannah has to offer. Yeah. And
Thank you.
thanks everyone for watching, and bye for now.